Hi everybody. Hi, welcome back everybody. Just in the interest of time, we might make a start with the next session. I hope you eventually found the morning tea. Sorry, it's a little bit further away than we originally thought, so that's where lunch will be, and afternoon tea as well. So I'm chairing the next session, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Pamela Snow. Pam is head of the Rural Health School at Trobe University, and she's a registered psychologist and a speech pathologist, having originally qualified in speech pathology. She's a fellow of the Speech Pathology Association of Australia, and is past Victorian State Chair of the Australian Psychological Society. Please join me in welcoming Professor Snow.
Thanks, Rowan. Good morning, everyone. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting this morning, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and like Paul MacDonald, I think, expressed my great shame that we all feel about the overrepresentation of young people from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds in the population that we're here talking about today. I'd like to thank Rowan and Stuart for the opportunity to be part of this meeting today. It's terrific to see so many people, practitioners, researchers, coming together talking about this important question of the health needs of young people in the youth justice system and conceptualising their very existence within a health framework. I'll apologise up front to those of you who may have heard me speak recently. There will be, you'll hear some things again, but that's called consolidation in memory terms. And it also means that you should do a little better in the test at the end, so we'll see. Now, that's not good when the mouse doesn't work. What am I doing wrong? It's not advancing. I can just use, is there a keyboard? Sorry. That's all right. Okay, that's right. There's always an alternative. What I'd like to do in the time that we have together this morning is talk to you about a notion that's very dear to my heart and very dear to the research that I've been doing in this space now for about 17 years. And this is really trying to position language and language competence front and centre with respect to vulnerable young people. So I want to touch on this notion of what language is, how it's influenced in the developmental space, why that's important. I'll talk a little bit about evidence on language and the social gradient. I want to have a bit of a focus on this tragic thing called the school-to-prison pipeline. I think it's tragic that there is such a construct that's described in the literature. What we know about young people in the youth justice system and their language skills, and how this can all be made relevant in both an intervention and a prevention sense in relation to that school-to-prison pipeline. So it's a fair bit to get through in a brief amount of time. Wearing my speech pathology hat, when I'm talking about oral language, I'm talking about everyday talking and listening skills. So speech pathologists or speechies will talk about expressive language skills, what I'm using now, using my ability to put my ideas and thoughts into words and sentences that hopefully make some sense to you, as you in turn are using your receptive language skills, so your auditory processing skills, you're making sense of the words that I'm using to understand what I'm saying. It's terribly important when we think about language skills, and particularly when we think about the language skills of vulnerable young people, that we remember that this is a two-channel process. We're not just thinking about what these young people can say, we also have to consider what they can understand. What they can say is reasonably visible to us, what they can understand is largely invisible to us, and that creates a whole raft of difficulties in itself. Now, speech pathologists obviously drill down on this notion of language, and I'm not here today to give you a 101 on everything I've ever learnt about language and linguistics, but it is important to consider that all of us in this room have a very sophisticated grasp of language and how language works. You all know a lot about syntax, you know a lot about morphology, you know a lot about phonology. Might not be able to articulate the things that you know, but you have a very rich and sophisticated implicit knowledge of linguistics in order to be competent everyday users of language. So to be a competent everyday user of language, you have to understand language form, the rules of syntax and morphology and phonology. You have to understand language content, which is largely about vocabulary and semantics. And you have to be able to understand that how you use language needs to vary according to the situational context. So the way that I'm talking to you now is different from how I'll talk to you if we're having a chat over lunch because of situational context. And that little burst of sunshine in the middle brings them all together to constitute competence. And it doesn't take much of a shift in any of these parameters for language competence to fall over or be debrided in some way. So that's just to emphasise again, this is a two-channel process. We have to think about receptive language skills as much as we think about receptive language skills. Everyday interactions with each other would be really boring if we only ever said exactly what we mean. If we were very literal in all of our interactions with each other, it would sound like we were all lawyers probably, and we're putting the commas and the full stops in the right place, with all due respect to lawyers in the room. We make our everyday interactions with each other more interesting by using a raft of linguistic devices such as similes, metaphor, idioms, jokes. Sarcasm is a very tricky linguistic device whereby we say the exact opposite of what we mean and expect the listener to do a mental inversion and to find the hidden intended meaning. And you have to be a pretty sophisticated language user in order to do that. All of these linguistic devices and many more rest as their fulcrum of these linguistic devices is our language skills, our vocabulary skills, our ability to perform mental manipulations of meaning in real time in social interactions. Language development occurs in the context of, ideally, warm, nurturing, responsive adult-child relationships. Again, I think it's fair to say that hopefully most of us in this room experience some form of warmth and responsiveness. We were spoken to in motherese or parentese. We were looked after by adults who were child-led, who displayed warmth and responsiveness and attunement, and in the process gave us words for feelings. So that early interpersonal space not only creates the basis of hopefully secure attachment, which forms the template, if you like, for all of our interpersonal relationships across the lifespan, but it also gives us words for affective states, for emotional feelings, which become our tools for emotional self-regulation as we move through infancy, childhood and adolescence. Having words for feelings is critically important if we're going to take the reins for emotional self-regulation. So for that reason, language is also closely tied to social cognition. I guess in a broad, everyday, popular psychology vernacular, social cognition is a bit like emotional intelligence. So our ability to read other people and to draw inferences about things that other people might be wanting to communicate but don't feel socially that they can say. And this is important because as humans, we are socialised to play against our emotions. If I keep talking on and on and on, long beyond my allotted time today, Stuart and Rowan will probably be playing against their emotion for a little while, not indefinitely. They'll be getting a bit frustrated, a bit anxious, the whole day's going to slide away, and they'll sit there and they'll nod and they'll smile, but eventually the non-verbal cues and maybe even the verbal cues will translate into something more explicit. We couldn't do what we're doing now if we couldn't play against our emotions as human beings. So this is a very important part of our evolution as a species. However, it also makes it very tricky for people who are not good at decoding non-verbal skills and haven't had that sophisticated, consistent, warm, adult-led training, if you like, in that early emotional space about what human responses and emotions actually mean. And of course, social cognition is very sensitive, even in the best of circumstances, to children's developmental stage. So those of you who have children will know that sometimes 3-year-olds say the most excruciating things, although they might be perfectly honest. They say things that their parents don't want them to say in that particular situation because they don't understand all the social rules. Now, if I was working with you in a workshop today, I'd ask you to have a crack at what you think might be going on here. We don't have time to do this in a workshop format, but really it's a bit of a trick question anyway, because language skills are used for such an incredibly wide range of purposes in everyday human interactions. And if you run your eye down those lists, and they're not finite lists by any manner or means, you can probably tick off a whole lot of things that you've done with your language skills already today, and it's not even lunchtime. So not only can you do a lot of those things, you know that you have to switch code or register according to the social context that you're in. So you have to use those skills differently according to constraints and demands of the social situation. So there's nothing pedestrian or everyday about language skills, except that we have to use them every day in order to survive as human beings. Now, I like to think that skilled communicators have a bit of a secret weapon in their back pocket, and that secret weapon is a dial that has really, really finite gradings on it. So skilled communicators can make very fine adjustments to the way that they are interacting with others. They can do little repairs in the conversation if a little rip occurs because someone's misunderstood, got the wrong end of the stick. A skilled communicator can say, oh, hang on, no, that's not what I meant, sorry, you've misunderstood me, or maybe I didn't make myself, or maybe I wasn't clear the first time. So skilled communicators are constantly reading cues from the other person and making little adjustments. The young people that we're here to talk about today have a communication dial that looks a bit more like that. So it's on or off, and there's not very many gradients in the setting. So things are okay, or things are arcing right up, or there might be very little happening in the communication space at all. And of course, all of us, to succeed interpersonally, have to be able to deal with very busy social traffic, and we have to be able to disambiguate very heavy social traffic on a daily basis. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit about the evidence about language exposure and the social gradient. Hart and Risley, a couple of American speech pathology researchers in the mid-1990s, conducted a landmark study where they recruited 42 families, which doesn't sound very like much of a sample size, but the impact of this study comes from the depth of the enormous amount of data that they collected and the depth and richness of the analysis that they conducted. These families were stratified across the SES spectrum, and what they did was that they recruited these families when they had an infant who was about 6 months old, and they started data collection when that infant was 10 months old, and they took tape recorders into the home with all of the relevant ethics approvals, of course, and recorded the amount of child-directed speech that was being that those children were experiencing, and they kept doing that until these children were 3 years old on a weekly basis. And what they found was that children of professional parents were having a bit over 2,000 words an hour directed to them. So this isn't ambient adult talk, it's what's being directed to them. Children of parents on welfare benefits were having about 600 words an hour directed to them, and children of working class parents were sitting somewhere in the middle. Now, this was of immediate interest and concern to us when we started this research 17 years ago, because obviously we know, and as Linda's mentioned already, young people in the youth justice and child protection systems, there's a huge overrepresentation of children from low SES families and communities. So this immediately flagged up the fact that there might be some reason to be concerned about the language skills of these young people. However, I can say, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but a bit of a spoiler alert, our research has shown that SES alone is not the explanatory mechanism for why so many young people in the youth justice system have really impoverished language skills. So it's important. It's a significant background level of disadvantage, but it's not the explanatory mechanism. What this famously and importantly translates into, though, is a 30 million word advantage by age 4 for the children of professional parents over the children of parents on welfare benefits. So if you're a preschool teacher, that's a pretty big gap that you're thinking about trying to make up. If you're in an area where you've got mixed demographics, so you've got some children who've had this huge wealth of language exposure and experience and others who've had much less. Bearing in mind too that there are important qualitative differences in this data, not just quantitative differences. We tend to get a bit hung up sometimes on that 30 million word difference because it is important, but the children of professional parents were hearing far more encouraging and elaborate utterances, where the children of parents on welfare benefits were hearing far more commands, instructions and short clipped utterances. So the qualitative differences are just as important. Hart and Risley also followed these children up into primary school and, not surprisingly, at ages 9 and 10, showed strong links between early language exposure and academic achievement. There's a whole raft of factors that determine academic achievement, but obviously this is longitudinal research as well as being cross-sectional. Now, I always think it's important to put in a caveat here. Low SES is not deterministic of every gloomy possible outcome. Not all low SES families provide linguistically undernourishing environments. Not all high SES families do a fabulous job of providing linguistically rich environments. We have to be interested not only in financial capital but also human and social capital. It's all important, but this research has been replicated elsewhere, and there's particularly strong research coming out of the UK in this space, and there's good evidence to show that SES differences persist into adolescence, at least in continuing to influence academic performance. Okay, you all look like you're flagging a little bit to me, so I want you to do something for me. Okay, you ready? It's important that you get this right. I want you to pick up your phylodactyphone and place it periplantally along the hyperspondyle aspect of your dipaxon. Come on. Jump to it. Okay, so welcome to the world of the kid with a language impairment. You know you're meant to do something, you've been asked to pay attention, you all look like you were pretty willing to oblige, and you knew that there was an instruction in there somewhere, and you probably would have complied with the request if you'd had half a clue of what I was on about. And if I'm the teacher, you're immediately looking to me like someone who's not very cooperative. So I'm going to start thinking of you as a bit of a behaviour problem, and I'm going to keep an eye on you because I reckon I know where you're going. You've been warned. Okay, in the first 3 years of school, we asked children to cross a precarious but life-changing bridge. We asked them to cross the bridge from talking and listening on this side to reading and writing on the other side. And again, I'd wager that everyone in this room got across that bridge, and I reckon you probably got across that bridge, you probably skipped across it in many cases. You may not have even been aware that you were on a bridge. It was so fun and intrinsically enjoyable and rewarding. Many children, however, fall off this bridge, metaphorically, and never get to the other side. The transition to literacy is not a biologically natural act. That's a lie of the whole language movement, and we need to put paid to that lie. That was never based on any empirical cognitive psychology evidence. It was somebody's idea that took hold like a bushfire and has done decades of harm in education and teacher pre-service education. The transition to literacy requires specific and prolonged instruction. Some children require even more specific and prolonged instruction, and they tend to be the kids who come from those more disadvantaged backgrounds where there's been less rich language exposure and book exposure. It builds very heavily on psycholinguistic competencies, knowledge of language that are acquired before school entry. And if we think of the transition to literacy, this simple thing, learning to read and write, in a public health context, we think of it as something that promotes academic achievement, school attachment and retention, a positive sense of well-being. It's a protective factor. We talk about risk and protective factors. We want to talk about early intervention. Get reading and writing right at the start. That would have to be the simplest, cheapest piece of public health intervention that we could, if we had the political will, probably do next week. Language skills are a very recent development in evolutionary terms. Reading skills are very recent in evolutionary terms. We've only been reading and writing for about 6,000 years. So as Joe Elliott from the UK said when he was out here last year, in evolutionary terms, that's since about yesterday morning. That's a very, very recent phenomenon. It's been said that literacy is parasitic on language, and that's because learning how to read is fundamentally a linguistic task. So by now you should be starting to get a bit worried about those, if you're not already, about those kids who don't have very well developed language skills when they arrive at school. And many children, in fact, have just enough in the way of everyday talking and listening skills when they arrive at school to fly under the radar. Nobody really notices that they've got huge gaps in their vocabulary and their comprehension and their discourse skills, because they've got enough in the way of basic social skills to go undetected. Okay, I like to think of literacy and language as being inseparable best friends rather than one being parasitic on the others. Parasites ultimately destroy their hosts, so that metaphor doesn't quite work. Have a look, though, at the growth in vocabulary comprehension requirements that are needed for children to succeed at primary school. In Year 2, you need to understand about 300 words to deal with the academic curriculum. By Years 3 and 4, that's up to 3,500 words. By Year 5, you need to be able to understand 10,000 words just to deal with the everyday academic curriculum. That's a huge hike in vocabulary comprehension over a short period of time. After 3 years of formal schooling, an important, a subtle but important transition occurs, and that's the transition from learning to read to reading to learn. Irrespective of how evidence-based early literacy instruction is, and sadly in this country and many Western nations that's highly variable, irrespective of that though, the first 3 years of school have a big emphasis on learning to read. But if you miss the learning to read boat, the reading to learn boat sails before you've even got up in the morning. You didn't even know such a thing needed to be caught. Other kids catch it and you don't know where everyone else is. So you come back in Victoria after grade 2, which is the third year of formal schooling, and now everything's different. The teacher isn't teaching us to read anymore. Now the teacher's expecting me to use my emergent literacy skills to do a project on Australian animals or on the solar system. And I've got to find information for myself, read it, synthesise it, and somehow put it together. And it never surprises me when I talk to audiences of primary school teachers, which I do quite a bit, that they say, oh, that's when the problem boys really start to make their presence felt, around grade 3. And that's because that learning to read, reading to learn transition opens up a cavernous rift for many of those boys. The reading literature also makes reference to a notion called the Matthew effect, and that's a biblical reference to the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So children who enter school with well-developed oral language skills, vocabulary, narrative skills, comprehension skills, syntactic complexity because of that rich immersion that they've experienced in the preschool years, are ready to cross that bridge, make the transition to literacy and soak up everything on the other side that life has to offer via literacy, and they take off. Where the children with poorly developed foundational oral language skills flatline compared to their more able peers. Paradoxically, those children who take off experience an unexpected and sometimes hidden compounding benefit to their oral language skills because they encounter new words for the first time through reading. And the way that parents know that that's happening is that kids drop these words into the conversation, and not always in a contextually appropriate way, and they often mispronounce them. So they put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, and the parents go, huh, what? And they realise that the kid's dropping a word into the conversation that they've been exposed to through reading. So there's an additional example of the rich getting richer. Now, all of this has led me to think about packaging the importance of oral language in a way that we can make it important to everybody's work, not just the work of primary school teachers, but policymakers as well. And when I talk to teachers in particular, I use the analogy of building a house. And I say, if you're going to build a house, you know you can't start with the walls, and you most certainly can't start with the roof. When you're going to build a house, you start thinking first about the foundations, but even before you can put the foundations in, you have to think about the soil quality. Where are you going to be putting those foundations so that they don't sink? So in this analogy, the soil is the solid ground of social and emotional context for language use. If you go back to that earlier image of that mother and the infant, highly attuned and responsive to each other, we want that warmth, that secure attachment and responsiveness to be in place as the solid ground. Then we can think about starting to build language skills as being like the granite foundations of our house. They've got to be rock solid. But language competence isn't done and dusted by age 5, and that's why we've got a brick pattern in the walls that represents the fact that they have to keep being built through childhood and adolescence, and indeed right across the lifespan. So once we've got the foundations in place, we can think about the walls on one side being the transition to literacy, because learning to read and write, they're fundamentally language skills, and the development of pro-social interpersonal skills, using language in ways that help you to succeed in the interpersonal space in navigating your way through the business of everyday life. And again, those two sets of skills develop over a very long period of time. Only then can we think about the roof of the house. And the roof of the house, of course, is academic achievement, it's social engagement, it's having marketable employment skills, being able to transition to further education or training, remembering that we live in an increasingly technology-based society where jobs at the what used to be called, when I was growing up, the blue-collar end of the work market are disappearing. And I always use as the example of this self-checkouts in supermarkets. I hate them because I also think supermarkets are really clever, that they get you to buy their goods and do their work for them. I mean, really, that is such a clever business model. But if you think about the kind of jobs those self-checkouts take away, they take away unskilled employment and replace them with highly skilled employment. You've got to go to university and do an IT degree, and to get to university and do an IT degree, you better have pretty good reading and writing skills, otherwise university's not going to be particularly interested in trying to support your education. So there is less and less on offer for young people who fall by the wayside and don't have those marketable literacy and numeracy skills. So what does all of this have to do with young people in the youth justice system? Well, we've heard a lot this morning from Linda's wonderful presentation about factors that lead young people into the youth justice system. We know that all of these factors here are overrepresented. I've highlighted the history of behaviour and conduct disturbance because I think that's the thing that adults do notice. Adults are sometimes not very clever at noticing some of the more subtle difficulties that children display in the developmental space, but you can bet your socks that adults will notice behaviour difficulties. And unfortunately, behaviour problems in childhood are a bit like a blanket that throw themselves over the child, and so that's all that the adults can see. They can see some wriggling shape underneath the blanket, but we need to take the blanket off and have a really good look at what else is happening underneath. Some research that was done in Toronto in the mid-1990s by Nancy Cohen and her team, they took a sample of boys referred from local elementary schools to a CAM service and these boys were referred purely on the basis of externalising behaviour problems, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, and they did formal assessments on their language skills, and they found a third of them straight up met clinical criteria for language impairment. Not one of them had been flagged by teachers or parents as a concern with respect to their language development. But then we can look at all of these factors again through a different lens and say, what do they mean for language development? All of the things that bode poorly for young people developmentally with respect to risk for ending up in the youth justice system happen to bode poorly for early language development as well. So we see exactly the same things, and not one of them is good for language development, let alone what it looks like when we put them all together. So there are very good a priori reasons why we should be concerned about the language and communication skills of young people in the youth justice system. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the research that I've been doing, predominantly with Martine Powell from Deakin University since, we started publishing back around 2001, but we started the work a little earlier than that. We've worked both with community-based and custodial samples. We've worked in Victoria and New South Wales. We've researched predominantly young males aged 13 to 20, but we have recently in a New South Wales study included a large sample, or a large-ish subsample, 30 young people from ATSI backgrounds, and a small female subgroup, because we're aware of just how under-researched the females are in this space, and we want to start redressing that gap if we can. We've also recently moved into the intervention space. I'm a little bit sick of just describing what the problems are. We know how bad the problems are, but I'm very pleased that we've recently published an intervention study, and I'll get to that later, and also Nate Swain, who's here, a PhD student working with me, and Tricia Eadie is also about to publish an intervention study conducted at Parkville. So I consider that this field is maturing because we're moving beyond description and into the hard space of intervention. We've used a range of measures of receptive and expressive language skills. We've also measured mental health. We've measured a construct called alexithymia, which some of you may have come across. The prefix A, as you know, means lack of, lexi means words, and thymia means feelings. So alexithymia is lack of words for feelings. And we consider that construct is quite important in this population because of their often tricky trauma histories, and also the overrepresentation of neurodisabilities such as autism spectrum disorder, where we would expect to see problems putting feelings and words together and labels together. Now, in our research, it's important to say that neurodisabilities are underrepresented. In youth justice, more generally, they're overrepresented. In our research, they're underrepresented, and I suspect that's because young people who, for example, on the autism spectrum, when they hear about what our research is about, they probably go, look, thanks, but no thanks, because they recognise that it might be quite an uncomfortable space for them. But it is important that you bear in mind when I talk about the high rates of language impairment that that's without these young people in the sample. So we are absolutely for certain underestimating the prevalence of language impairment in the total population because of that distortion. We've found significant links with respect to language impairment and earlier involvement in the child protection system, and I echo Paul's comments earlier that these young people are one person each and they need one system each, but we do know that coming into youth justice via child protection increases the probability that you're going to have language difficulties, and we've also found links between the presence of and severity of language impairments and a history of greater levels of interpersonal violence. So, overall, our research indicates around 50 to 60% of young male offenders have clinically significant, so on clinical measures, widely used measures such as the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals. They're coming out in the clinical range. These problems, though, can't be explained on the basis of low IQ, neurodisability or mental health problems. There are also high rates of mental health problems in our samples, but they're not the explanatory mechanism for the language impairments. That's a comorbidity, and as Linda mentioned, comorbidity is very important in this space. We've also found very high rates of alexithymia, as you can see there, problems putting words to feelings. That doesn't correlate with language impairment, it doesn't explain language impairment, it sits alongside it. So that's important when we think about interventions that are talking about feelings, that these young people don't have many words for feelings and they're not even very good at identifying what their feeling states are. Some of this I've already said. Higher rates of language impairment in young people from ATSI backgrounds, even when we control very tightly for exposure to standard Australian English. Their scores aren't worse, there are just higher rates of young people from ATSI backgrounds falling in that clinical range. We've also found higher rates of language impairment in young female offenders, but their rates are not as high as the young males. So if we look at this in stark visual terms, we can see that young offenders, remembering that we are underestimating for sure what the rates are in the total population, young offenders compared to international estimates of language impairment in young people in the community. So that's around 7 to 10%. In young offenders, it's at least around 50%. There's some data that we're about to start analysing in depth from New South Wales, where their New South Wales Health Survey, where for the first time they performed formal language assessments on a sample of about 250 young people as they entered New South Wales juvenile justice, and also a literacy measure, a standardised literacy measure, and around 10% of those young people perform in the expected range. 10%. So this 50% is a very conservative estimate. Language problems occur across the board in this sample. They occur in the expressive domain, in the receptive domain, they impact on vocabulary, they impact on syntactic complexity, the use of figurative or idiomatic language, remember those examples that we talked about earlier, and their narrative skills, their ability to use language to share an experience, to tell a story about something that's happened to them. That's an incredibly important everyday human communication skill. We all use stories to share our life experiences with each other. There's been less done looking at literacy skills, but that's a space that we're moving into at the moment, and as I said, that New South Wales data explicitly links oral language skills and literacy skills, and the data's pretty depressing. Having language difficulties makes it hard to tell a story, and in a forensic sense, you've got to tell a story if you've got to provide evidence, if you've got to brief your legal counsel, if you've got to look somewhat authentic to a police officer, then you might be asked, what's your story? How do you account for yourself? Well, you need to be able to provide a narrative in order to respond to that requirement. Having language problems makes it hard to consider the listener perspective. So to make a judgment about what somebody already knows, what background information do you need to give them for this to make complete sense, for them to not be getting the wrong end of the stick, it makes it hard to use specific vocabulary. We called one of our early conference presentations about this work, yep, nup, dunno, maybe, because that's what you hear a lot of in this population. So because they don't have very good vocabularies, so they fall back on that readily available but fluffy, empty responses. Makes it hard to understand idiomatic or figurative language, sarcasm in particular, but any kind of turn of phrase that we use that we might not even be aware that we're using idiomatic language is very difficult for these young people to understand. It's hard to get a joke, it's hard to discern good humour from intended offence, and we know that young people, young offenders, if they're faced with ambiguous social cues, will favour a hostile attribution, so things arc up very quickly. It's hard to be an assertive communicator who can share the communication load, so being able to correct misunderstandings, avoid or repair offence, and reflect on your own communication skills. what does this mean for taking part in verbally mediated interventions? And here I highlight cognitive behaviour therapy. God bless its little cotton socks. There's been so much researched and done and talked about CBT, and it is an evidence-based psychological intervention. However, it doesn't get much more verbal than sitting down with a very verbally competent psychologist and thinking about your thinking. I can't think of anything more verbal than that, and yet we're asking young people with very limited verbal skills to engage in these very verbal psychological therapies. And of course, it's pretty much impossible to succeed academically because the entire academic curriculum is verbal, linguistic and text-based. So, implications. There's a raft of implications here for early intervention for so-called high-risk boys, especially where we see behaviour problems and learning difficulties coexisting. In some cases, I think we create the ideal perfect storm for behaviour problems and learning difficulties to coexist because we don't take early reading instruction seriously enough. So, surprise, surprise, the kids who arrive at school with a pretty empty suitcase when it comes to verbal skills are going to find it's pretty much uphill all the way, and they're not going to enjoy being in the classroom, and so they're going to start acting out. So as I said earlier, if we want to pull one early intervention lever right now, let's get early reading instruction right. There's implications for forensic interviewing, remembering that a lot of so-called forensic interviewing actually takes place in the school context. There's a lot of pressure on schools to be safe environments, to have anti-bullying policies that are real and have some teeth, if you like, in terms of implications and consequences. So teachers increasingly have to carry out interviews of children when there's been an incident in the school ground. But the kid with the poor language skills is going to be the kid who clams up, looks at their shoes and says dunno, and maybe just agrees with most of what the adult authority figure says, whether it's right or not, because they're not very good at being that assertive, competent communicator. There are implications here for restorative justice conferencing, and I'm always at pains to emphasise that I'm philosophically completely on side with restorative justice conferencing. Heaven knows it's far better than punitive approaches that we know do not work. However, we need to remember that restorative justice conferencing is a highly verbal, conversational process where victims, if they agree to this, and it only happens in situations where the young person pleads guilty and the victim agrees, are almost certainly looking for some kind of restoration around acknowledgement and authenticity and genuineness around young people saying something that sounds like an apology. And if you've ever had to make an apology to someone, and I suspect one or two people in this room have ever had to make an apology to someone, you'll know that it's a fairly demanding task emotionally, cognitively and linguistically, and you have to choose your words really carefully, and you know that there are shades of meaning, and you might be judged to be inauthentic if you choose a word that's just a little bit off on that communication dial that we talked about earlier. So I'm just about to start a study with a criminology colleague at Griffith, Hennessy Hayes. We've got some funding to look at restorative justice conferences through the lens of young people's language skills and see what happens from a victim perspective around satisfaction with the conference as a function of the young person's language skills. So watch this space. There's also implications for interventions for young people. I've mentioned CBT. There are specific programs that are implemented around anger management, sex offender programs, all highly verbal. And then there's the issue of literacy programs for young people once they're in the youth justice system. These young people missed the learning to read, reading to learn transition the first time round. We need to be very careful, I think, in thinking that we can just backfill that now that they've also got some very baked-on negative attitudes about everything to do with learning and literacy and very low self-esteem very often and shame in that space. So I would argue that we need to be doing a lot more around direct, explicit instruction in that space with young people in the youth justice system. Now, communication behaviour and this really depressing thing, the school to prison pipeline. When we think about behaviour and communication, I think we need to be remembering that behaviour is communication. They're not two different things. The way we all behave communicates a lot about who we are and how we feel. In many cases, for these young people, behaviour is all they've got. A 5-year-old who comes from a chaotic and violent home environment doesn't come into the classroom in the morning and say to the teacher, "Look, miss, I'm feeling a bit affectively dysregulated this morning, so it might be a good idea if you sit me down the front, because that'll probably help my attentional and working memory skills today." But that same 5-year-old can communicate that same information through their behaviour if the adults know how to disambiguate that information and recognise that what they're seeing is the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg itself is what we all need to be grappling with in terms of making schools safe, accessible places for learning to occur for these young people. Having said that, behaviour problems are serious mental health issues. So we need to be careful that we don't construct young people with behaviour problems as just bad kids. I'm no great fan of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, you know, that thing that's about the size of the LA phone book and it just gets bigger each time they bring out a new edition. However, disorders like conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder sit in the DSM alongside anxiety, depression, substance use disorders. They are mental health problems. It's not normal for an 8-year-old to be kicking, biting, scratching and being highly disruptive towards people around them. They're mental health problems, and they are flags that all is not well for that child. Many children, as I mentioned, with behaviour problems have unidentified but pervasive language difficulties. Very often behaviour problems are communicating a skill deficit or complex unmet emotional needs. Behaviour problems often occur comorbidly with low reading progress, and somehow we just kind of seem to accept that, and I don't know why we do accept that. But there is this issue of the soft bigotry of low expectations that I think really pervades the way we think about many of these young people from very early on in their academic careers. We need speech-language pathologists, teachers, parents, psychologists, other welfare and justice personnel to be working very collaboratively. As Paul McDonald said earlier, one child, one system. We should not be carving these children up into different systems. And I particularly am concerned about the high levels of suspension and exclusion. I didn't mention that in our last study in New South Wales, and I don't think New South Wales is any different from Victoria. They may have been our first penal colony, but I don't think that explains the high rates of suspension and exclusion in this sample. 87%, and we had a sample of 100 young people, 87 of them had experienced repeated suspension and exclusions, which would kind of suggest, given that they've ended up in custody in juvenile justice, that suspensions and exclusions don't work very well. They work very well if you don't want that kid in your school. They just don't work very well for that kid in the longer term. So we really need to be thinking suspensions and exclusions. And we also need to remember to not be too literal about what this term, the school to prison pipeline, means. There's more than one kind of prison. There are prisons that have bricks and razor wire. There's also the prison of social marginalisation, and many of these young people end up in that prison of social marginalisation, which somehow seems to be invisible to many of the rest of us, and it's much harder to get those young people out of that prison. So for me, this is a question of how we think about young people in the youth justice system. What do we see when we look at young people in the youth justice system? And as Andrew mentioned on the panel earlier, we're preaching to the choir here today because everybody here knows that these young people have complex, fraught backgrounds, and it should hardly be surprising, really, that they've ended up in youth justice if, in fact, they haven't died along the way. And we also have data from Victoria, from an audit of coronial records that was done by Carolyn Coffey and her colleagues probably about 15 years ago now at the Centre for Adolescent Health, that show extraordinarily high rates of death in young people in the youth justice system. So who do we see when we look at these young people? Obviously, we need to be seeing very vulnerable, very complex young people who've had years of complexity and neglect and maltreatment and trauma that have led to them being in front of a magistrate. We're not going to turn around those years with some simple, short-lived intervention. What we seem to be content to do now is just to continue to pay for these young people across multiple service systems and across several decades, rather than really investing solidly during that developmental period. So how do we disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline? Well, you may have heard me say this already this morning, but just in case, I'll say it again. The transition to literacy in the first 3 years of school is critical. You miss that learning to read boat, and if you come from a low SES family, if you come from a family environment marked by disadvantage and chaos, you are not going to make up that ground. Nothing is going to happen that is going to give you back the first 3 years of school when you are meant to reach key critical milestones with respect to literacy that you have to keep building on at exponential rates in order to succeed academically. So evidence-based early literacy interventions are central to this. Unfortunately, we continue to see a stronghold of whole language-based teacher education, and that hinders the translation into practice of a raft of good cognitive psychology evidence that tells us that children need to be exposed to high quality decoding instruction, phonics-based instruction. That's not enough on its own, but teachers need to know how to build that into their early literacy instruction. So it's necessary but not sufficient, but we know, and again, another PhD student of mine, Hannah Stark, here today, Hannah's research, and it's published research in Annals of Dyslexia, shows that teachers in Victoria in disadvantaged schools have very low levels of knowledge about the language constructs that are needed in order to teach reading in an evidence-based way. We can't allow that to continue. And the children in the tail of the curve, ironically, derive the most benefit from being exposed to evidence-based early literacy instruction. All children need to acquire decoding skills. Some of them just happen to pick it up almost by osmosis. They're the lucky ones. But some children require specific, explicit, high-quality instruction, and when they get that, it makes a huge difference to their educational trajectories. We don't need children who are already facing massive multiple risks to acquire edugenic academic failure. That's shameful. In a first world nation, a wealthy nation like Australia, we can't be standing by an education system where we have a third of 15-year-olds in this country who don't have literacy skills at the requisite level that they should have on OECD terms. A third of 15-year-olds. Now, I tweeted about this the other night and said that a third of 15-year-olds don't have learning problems. They've been exposed to dysteachia because of poor teacher education. It's not the teacher's fault, so I hasten to add this is not the teacher's fault. I got an immediate reply from a school principal who said that's an unbelievably nasty thing to say. Well, look, if I have to spend the rest of my career being a grumpy, nasty old lady, somebody has to say it. These kids are being failed by poor instructional approaches that are being foisted upon teachers in their pre-service education. And, of course, we need to reconceptualise behaviour disturbance. Boys with behaviour problems and learning difficulties at least need to be raising red flags, because we can do more early on if we think more creatively about those boys and ask about their language skills and start putting in place some serious language assessment and interventions. We need to remember, though, that language problems are invisible. These kids don't have a barcode on their forehead that makes a noise when they walk into the room that alerts everybody to the fact that they have a language difficulty. However, those language difficulties manifest in a range of ways that are unhelpful in a compounding way for these young people. So they look like rudeness, they look like lack of motivation, lack of engagement. We see these monosyllabic responses, staring at your shoes, drawing, circles on the floor with your feet, doing anything that you can to make this excruciating interaction come to an end, because I've just got nothing, and I know I've got nothing, and I don't like being in this interpersonal space. There are concerns from a forensic perspective, of course, about suggestibility, over-compliance and so forth. We know that language problems can be misconstrued as behaviour problems, they might be misconstrued as low IQ, and all the other things that we've already talked about today. A little bit of good news before I finish. As I mentioned, we've just published a small intervention study that we did in New South Wales in a custodial setting, a speech pathology intervention, working with 6 really complex young males, 4 of whom were from Aboriginal backgrounds, and what we found was that they all engaged really well and they all made gains over a 3 to 4 month period working one-to-one with a speech pathologist. So the evidence base is starting to build. Nate will be publishing his research from Parkville very soon with similar findings. So it's going to start to become harder and harder for youth justice systems in this country to ignore the evidence that speech pathology is a critical part of not only the prevention side of this argument but also the intervention side. Where to from here? I'm doing a couple of studies that are closely related to the school-to-prison pipeline. One on language and literacy skills of young people in flexible and alternative education settings. I don't know whether Anton's still here from the Net School. I know he had to pop out, but Anton Van Maan is here today. He'll be coming back. He's the principal of the Net School in Bendigo, and my wonderful research assistant, Amina McLean, over here is busily collecting data in the Net School, and we're also doing, Amina's also collecting data for me on a project on young people, adolescents in out-of-home care. And we're in conversation about taking our work in New South Wales to scale in Victoria, and doing a big intervention, hopefully at Parkville, that transitions back out into the community. Can I finish, and relax guys, I am finishing, I love quoting Rod Morgan, who used to be the chair of the UK Youth Justice Board in the UK, of course, that's tautology. He said, and these are provocative words, he said, "It may be too much to say that if we reformed our schools, we'd have no need of prisons. But if we better engaged our children and young people in education, we'd almost certainly have less need of prisons. Effective crime prevention has arguably more to do with education than sentencing policy." So those of you who work in education, when someone asks you next time you're out socially what you do, you say, "I work in crime prevention," because that's exactly what you do. Please keep in touch, email, Twitter, and I've written a number of short blog posts about a lot of aspects of what I've talked about today on my blog. So thank you.
Thank you, Pam. That was a fantastic presentation from a nasty, grumpy old lady. It was great.
You bet.
Her words, not mine.
Just ask my children.
It's really great to see, because I imagine that speech and language pathology is not the first thing that comes to mind when people hear about, young offenders or people involved in the justice system. I was really happy to see that a full 10% of the RSVPs today were from speech and language pathologists or students. So thank you for that as well. Thank you all for coming along. And I've had the pleasure of seeing Nate present some of his work last week, and at the 3-minute thesis, which is a fantastic presentation. It's some really good work. And I also got to see Mary Woodward talk in Brisbane last week about the project you mentioned. Fantastic work, and hopefully a big future in it. Obviously a big future in it. Okay, so we've got another panel before lunch. I'd like to invite up Dr. Mick Creety, who's a paediatrician from the Royal Children's Hospital here, and Brendan Murray, who's the Executive Principal of Parkville College. And I hope Dr. David Broderick from Victoria Police. So at this point, I'd just like to turn it over to the audience to see whether anybody's got any comments or questions on what we just saw, and in particular for the panellists who haven't spoken already. Yeah, sorry.
I'm okay without it.
Okay.
I was just wondering, it's a question for you, sorry. What does the speaking and listening to reading and writing transition look like for a 15 to 16-year-old individual who's already in custody? What does that look like, and how can us as youth justice practitioners assist the educators to develop the young person's skills?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Did everyone hear the question? So we're talking about talking and understanding, and then reading and writing within the youth justice setting. I don't think there's a lot of empirical evidence for us to draw on in this space. I'm going to tell you what I think. Brendan may have a slightly different view. My view is that because such high rates of these young people, and numbers of these young people have underlying language difficulties, that we need to be thoroughly assessing their language skills before we do literacy interventions. So the so-called simple view of reading is that it involves decoding, so being able to work out what the correspondence is between letters and sounds on the page, and comprehension. And there's a lot of underlying skills that sit below decoding and comprehension. So I can decode fairly well in French because I studied French at school, but I have such patchy vocabulary now in French that just because I can read a page of French text aloud doesn't mean I can understand it. So a thorough assessment of language tells us what's happening about vocabulary, it tells us what's happening about syntactic complexity, about ability to make sound and letter links, about grasp of figurative language and so forth. So for me, if you're giving me a blank piece of paper and saying write anything you want on it, I would be having all of those young people undergo a language assessment and then have bespoke literacy interventions that are targeting where the breakdown is occurring, but wrapping around that, of course, the need to be fostering self-esteem and getting early wins, creating opportunities for success, because I think there's such fragile self-esteem in this space by the time young people get to youth justice, and they've had years of failure and embarrassment and exclusion. But Brendan, you might want to comment on that as well.
I agree with Pam. The difficulty is that, from my perspective, I agree with Pam that we're confused about what we're actually doing in education within schools, and that plays out, even though we're aware of it, within youth justice. So as the educators here are all aware that we will do testing almost immediately to find out, to a degree, where kids are at with their language and how we should adapt to that and cater to those needs and support their development. But we will rapidly progress them into a state curriculum and require them to write. It's a competing interest that we have to grapple with. We have a statutory authority that says if you want to operate as a school and be involved in curriculum, you must impose this learning on the kid. So all the teachers would say, which they do regularly to me, this isn't what we should be doing, we should be doing something else. And we have to sort of find our way through that. From my perspective, the 15-year-old comes in and they're so confused and tripped up with interventions throughout their education system. And in a way, the best thing we could do is speak with children and help develop their language. And I agree with Pam that we sort of have a plan of attack of trying to create a secure attachment and work on that foundation level in the house, and then try to engage with the young person in a sort of an agreement in a therapeutic alliance that we'll go on this journey together and try and work it out, because there's no silver bullet, there's no single solution here. For youth justice, to support that, and this is a long conversation, but Pam and I have talked about having 20 speech pathologists as an example in to help support and train. One day we'll do that. Really good screening. The best you can be, I think, is to be provide really good support around the child, be really good people, be trustworthy, predictable, reliable, consistent adults who can form a relationship and be involved in the education. So it's just not happening in the classroom. I've talked forever about this, but
Thanks, Brendan. Does anyone else have any questions? Like a question, Andrea?
Just thank you, Pam, for a light bulb moment with that alexithymia. I never heard that term before, and it reminded me of students I've worked with in the past in schools who I think were in so much pain because they couldn't express their feelings and were just really tortured by being trapped by that. Come to just yesterday when I was looking at a student's thesis where she's writing up a photo voice analysis of the photos that students have done who are working on a BCAL program in secondary school. And I was just delighted to see how beautifully themes came out from the students in her analysis with the photos that they used. So my question is, are there other means of finding a way forward for some young people when, if they are unable to grasp the skills and complexity of language, the use of other means like, visuals and pictorial and even drama or whatever, other means where young people with that condition, or not condition, sorry, probably the wrong word, can find a way forward?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and I'm hoping one can hear the question about ways of getting around this issue of not just language problems more generally, I guess, but specifically that alexithymia issue, lack of words for feelings. And it's not just lack of words for feelings, it's also an inability to identify what one's own affective state currently is at this point in time. Again, I can't call deeply on the empirical literature here, but my theoretical hunches would tell me three things. That teachers and clinicians need to be having language skills front of mind when they're interacting with these young people. So tearing back our language, not using complex embedded sentences, not using tricky idiomatic figurative language, allowing extra time, saying the same thing a few different ways, perhaps to consolidate the meaning. So that's one thing. But I also think we need to be looking at alternative forms of expression in a therapeutic context, like art or drama or photo diaries, language. Yeah. So we need alternative ways of getting these young people to tap into those feelings and their experiences and share them. And again, in my ideal blank piece of paper, blue sky world, I can speech pathologists working with those young people to strengthen their language skills. The last thing we should be doing is giving up. And as I said earlier, just falling back on that soft bigotry of low expectations and thinking, well, let's just do these kids out.
Thanks, Pam. I was just like to say one thing. I was struck by your the comment about switching codes between talking to your parents, talking to police, supporting a football match. And Dave, I wondered if you had any thoughts about young people having contact with the police, perhaps if they don't have that ability to interact effectively, whether you've had any experience of seeing how that might play out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for Pamela 2 times, because I was fortunate enough to hear Pamela speak very recently at a Blue Light conference, which sure many people remember the old Blue Light discos, or Blue Light does a bit more than just discos these days, but the beauty of that, because they do some really great work right across the board, but that was a mixture of police, that was also many people from the broader youth sector. But there were a lot of heads knocking during your presentation at that time, which means I think it really sort of struck a chord with many police and also many youth justice workers. So I guess the relevance, particularly for police, is the fact that police are often the formal entry point into the youth justice system for many people. I emphasise the word formal because, as we probably agree, that many people are offending well before they're detected, and the path might be sort of diverting well before they. The interaction between police is not just limited to that first contact on the street or in a public place, but right through into the interview room where, as Pamela's really highlighted for us, some things can go really wrong. One thing that sort of struck me when I was considering the presentation the first time and getting it was the fact that across police, across youth justice, right across the sector, we're investing a lot in diversion for young people, both at that pre-charge sort of child cautioning level, but also through the courts and other areas. And again, listening to this presentation it sort of occurred to me that divergence seems to be very much contingent upon some language competence, as you've said, and I really wonder about how we sort of factor that into this process, whereby in many cases it might require an admission of guilt or showing remorse or something like that, and from what I'm gathering from this is that language impairment may sort of impair a young person's ability to do something like that. So I guess for me, the question remains how we translate this into practice for police, for youth justice, for courts, right across the board, where we may not have access to a speech pathologist there and then, but these are still really relevant considerations for us. It's too big. If you've got a response,
I'll be answering my back pocket.
Right.
I wish. I think, just the level of engagement from organisations like the police and, the fact that someone like me is being asked to come and speak at those kind of conferences shows an interest in this, and people recognise that this is a pervasive issue in their interactions with young people. So hopefully we would start to see some trickle down of this kind of evidence into police training. There is about to be a pilot in Victoria of the use of registered intermediaries for adults with communication impairments who are victims, possibly. There's this debate still going on about whether it's going to translate to suspects. There's a lot of mixed views about the use of intermediaries. The pro side says, you've got someone there whose job is it's not their job to advocate for the person, it's their job to ensure that justice is done in a way that language is transacted in a trial. Whereas other people say that's the bottom of the cliff kind of response, we should be doing stuff at the top of the cliff and training everybody who's involved in the administration of justice around appropriate use of language. And in reality, we probably need to work both ends off against the middle on this, and perhaps having intermediaries as an interim thing, but also looking at training. It's not just police, it's also the judiciary, who love complex, flowery language, because that ties us all in knots and we agree with the proposition that's put to us under pressure.
Thanks, Pam. I'm just aware of the time, so I want, in about 5 minutes, maybe time for one or two more questions and any other comments from the panel. Mick, if you've got any thoughts about your work in the past?
Yes, so there's a fantastic panel. I think it's really groundbreaking. You speak a better understanding of who these kids are as individuals. Just my background, I worked in youth justice as a doctor for 2 years. I've seen sort of a lot of kids there. I worked with those with the Aboriginal Health Service. So you see a lot of kids in contact with the youth justice system and actually in contact. And worked in the adolescence, Department of Adolescence for about 15 years. So they really did strike a chord. It gives a good way of understanding these kids as individuals and what they're struggling with. I think we need to break down schools-wide concept. There's the education, there's also school retention. I've seen 2 kids in the last week in grade one who are being sent home at 11 o'clock every day because they're acting out, and we put a lot on teachers to have to understand. The schools are not resourced to handle kids with language difficulties, but they're expressing that language difficulties and behaviour. I see a lot of kids in secondary school. What's the language issue? What's the behaviour issue? The 3-year-old has a tantrum. As a 7-year-old not throwing against him in the class. There's a 15-year-old hitting someone in the playground. That's very annoying. It's only teaching the fuck off. Whereas they really got a hand, not how they express themselves. So these are behaved because they've got language problems which are labelled as the suspension or criminal protection and assaults. And I think understanding what's behind these behaviours is critical, and I think this language, if you understand these kids like that language exercise to me, is something because that's the only way you can say it, and not just getting it, you know, that natural effect of things getting into this. So really, I think that's fantastic. I think retention is important. I learned more at lunchtime in grade 9 within class, and I think I've been struggling with seeing another level. I haven't seen that yet. Lunchtime, I haven't got the resources. There's a different type of learning. So I think the schools are struggling and needs more than just education, but more pro-social activities. I agree that I see lots of kids setting different behavioural issues. There's a real lack of resources to retrain performers who aren't accustomed to getting in action, how to go to one be charged and how to learn the system to engage in mental health services. The public mental health services will pick up young kids behaviour issues that once they're secondary 12 for them for them to keep their knowledge. I know I can take behavioural difficulties. There's a massive trauma-based language services are understanding the trauma and language and culture of these kids. Often have to attend their services, which is just the wrong paradigm. And the last point is, I saw a lot of kids and getting their stories, but they can't express themselves. It's difficult. So who holds these kids' stories once they're in custody? We don't see the families. They're excluded from custody during working hours. Professionals don't have a story. You start working on that story. I've said this 1,000 times, but no, the bank knows no overseas, so it's on electronic database on the electricity system is hopeless, and there's no one holding these kids' stories or expecting kids to learn stories, tell stories and advocate themselves. They just can't. So I think understanding that is vital. That was my perspective.
Thanks, Mick. That's fantastic.
Could I just make one quick comment?
Sure,
Thank
sure.
you very much for that affirmation from your clinical perspective. I just want to really emphasise, and I think you would appreciate this, that I fully agree that schools and teachers are not adequately resourced, and I should have said that more explicitly in my presentation. I don't want anyone to go away from my presentation today thinking that I'm critical of teachers. I think teachers and schools do amazing jobs against amazing odds, and in the context of ridiculous resource restrictions, and in one of my former roles I coordinated a graduate diploma in mental health for teaching professions, so it was a program designed to upskill teachers around high prevalence mental health and behavioural issues that they encounter in the classrooms, and these teachers universally said to me there's nothing in our pre-service education that prepares for this, and yet they go into classrooms everywhere that have very high prevalence rates of these issues. So whilst I want to give teachers and schools my every backing, I really want to uphold teacher educators to account on what they're not equipping our teaching workforce to do. And surprise, surprise, we get very high burnout rates in young teachers who do it for a few years and decide, no, I just can't keep doing this anymore because it's sucking me dry. Well, we shouldn't be surprised about that.
Thanks, Pam. And thanks to all of the panellists. It sounds like we agree that resourcing is a major issue in this area, and it would be great to send in 20 SLPs to Parkville and to every school to try and remedy this problem at an early time. I'm just aware of the time, so I might draw this session to a close. If you could just thank me and join me in thanking the panellists and So lunch is served in the same spot, so it's a little bit further away than we originally thought, out the back, turn left. We're supposed to be back at 1:30, so I thought we could maybe come back at 1:40. We'll make a start at 1:40.